Good afternoon and welcome into the Takeup. Today we have episode 178, Stitches by the Numbers. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome into the Takeup. Happy to have you here for this Education Friday as we ramp up into the end of the year. Probably for a bit of a short show. I know I sometimes say that and go for an hour and a half, but hey, I'm here to answer the questions you have. So if you are here live and you have something you want to ask, particularly as it pertains to the topic today of stitches by the numbers, we're going to talk about the way stitches look, how they are put together, why measurements matter, and why I care about all of these technical numbers that I talk about, whether it's from density to stitch length to partition lines to text weight on threads or thread weight to measurements of all kinds, stitch counts, the way we layer, all these things that end up into measurements. And admittedly, I'm talking about the numbers today, but when I'm talking about numbers, I'm really talking about values. I'm talking about the things that we change that alter the way our stitches turn out on the machine. Why do I care about all those numbers? You want to know about that? I'm going to talk about that today and explain why I often use technical language and why I often share things that look like, diagrams that have tons of information packed into them or have you looking at tiny tenths of millimeters. Why do I care about this stuff? Because understanding how stitches get put together is knowing how to change those numbers, how to change those variables and values to get what you want out of the stitches. And it also enables you to have what I call a base embroidery or a base digitizing knowledge, a foundational knowledge upon which you can build. You can make anything else you want. You can make things that you want if you understand. Outside of the tools that are automated that are given to you, you can use anything up to and including, very much including the automated tools, and go all the way back down to the manual stitch, the single stitch, and create groupings of those stitches, motifs based on those stitches that do what you want them to do, provided you understand what changing these numbers will do to the final look of the stitches and the way they run. Understanding the numbers is controlling them. Controlling the numbers is getting what you want out of embroidery and out of your software. Also, having that foundational knowledge means that any software you go to, any tools you go to, any threads you want to use, any tool you want to alter, change, play with, you are armed to do so. If you know what kind of stitches you want, what you want them to look like, and where they should go, and you know what the different variables related to that stitch type, or stitches in general mean and how to use them, you can make what you want. And this goes further into design analysis. If you've seen any of my shows talking about analyzing designs or even analyzing embroidery pieces that are in front of you, then you know that measurement and understanding how things are put together means that you can replicate things that are sitting in front of you that you're looking at. Whether this is literally in the thread, because yes, you can take a sample and get down there with some magnification and find out exactly what's in it. I could take my embroidered sample, anything that I have that I want to replicate. This is just me pulling a piece of embroidery that's sitting next to me, and I can magnify that thing and look at it. And hey, if I want to get really crazy, we can go to magnification, take the loop out, look at it, measure distances between stitches, measure stitch lengths, and replicate. Or especially if we have it digital, if we get a stock design from someone that we truly love, we can watch that stock design, measure the stitch lengths, measure the densities, watch how it's put together, see how it's layered, how it's built, and replicate effects from it. But all of that is based on what? The stuff that I put in the thumbnail. Stitches by the numbers, measurements, understanding how these things are put together, and what all these terms mean, the jargon. Frankly, pardon me, you caught me taking a sip behind the camera there. Truth of the matter is, understanding these numbers is fundamental to knowing what's going on while you're looking at these files. And being someone who was self-taught originally, in the first part of my career, I didn't have any informational, content to go on. It was before the days of YouTube. I did a lot of my work by watching other people's designs run and then pulling them open in software and analyzing, watching them run digitally, measuring these distances, measuring the things that were there, and observing what was there and what was possible, and replicating settings, replicating styles, replicating textures for myself so that I could figure out what's going on. So, like I said, this is why we're talking about this stuff. the numbers are not just dry figures. That's not all they are. These are the keys, the elemental keys to making things work. So let's get into it, right? But first, as you guys know, if you're here live, I like to say hi to everybody who says hi. I'm going to jump in for a second with comments. If you have other questions, things you want to talk about, feel free to say so. But if nothing else, you know that if you're in the live crew, you get a little bit of love at the beginning of the show. If you're here for the, and cringy as it is, hashtag replay squad. If you people are here, feel free to fast forward if you want to. But hey, I'd still love your comments, questions, and things you'd like to know for a future episode. So please get in the comments and talk about this stuff with us. But here, we got some folks here. Joe Rita, who does some awesome landscape work. Love to see you here, Joe Rita. Got Scott coming in, Sunrise Tactical Gear. I'll call out your company name. Why not? We could do that. Minnesota Custom Made. Barb is here saying good afternoon to everybody. Love that you guys are talking to each other as well. Frank from across the pond doing awesome work with Sandpiper. So I'll try to remember his name. I can't always make it. Everybody talking to each other. Love that. Ron is here from Milk River. Ron, thank you for being here. Ron, who has done this thing old school when the measurements mattered even more because you weren't doing this stuff with automated filling and automated processing. So yeah, the big old school board digitizing, that's where the measurements really mattered. The cartoonist had to put in the actual measurements, roll that stuff out for you and make it work. And frankly, honestly, this is something we should all know though. And if you're here saying, I don't digitize that much, yeah, I know this will be a little bit dry for you as far as an episode. However, you knowing this also lets you ask a digitizer what's going on. You can tell them, hey, stitch counts are high and I feel like things are running a little dense, maybe three-dimensional density. We talk about how many penetrations we have in an area because that's part of how we end up with our material getting stiff and rolling out. So it's not just density of, everybody imagines density as a layers thing or as a tightness of stitches thing, which it is for our visual look at density, 2D density, but 3D density. How many penetrations in one point, those wedges of thread that are spreading the threads in the fabric apart and making everything bunch and curl. We can talk about that with the digitizer and say, hey, part of this, I think your stitch length is a little short. I'm looking at the fills and my stitch length here is 3 millimeters and I'd really like to see it around 4. Can you do that for me? That's something you can do if you know what that stitch length is in the fill and what differences it makes. Understanding the basics, understanding the way that these stitches go together is always going to give you a better handle, even if you're asking somebody else to make the changes. Though I would love to see all of you take up digitizing software and play. Even if you're never going to do it commercially or even for your hobby, you're not going to digitize all your designs. You're only going to do some customization or fix some things or maybe make a simple thing when you feel like it. I still think it's a lovely thing to do. Everything has to be thought of that way. And I think if you understand, you just have better tools than everybody else will have. Lisa Shaw, awesome educator in her own right, checking in saying, you can't emphasize this enough. Design analysis is the best teacher. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the other thing I'm going to tell you is learning about digitizing is learning about why other people's files don't turn out the way you want them to, by the way. If you learn the basics of digitizing and how these things are set up, and even if you look at software and see how things are entered, where those variables go and what they mean, you can talk about this with someone in a way that is much more educated. And when you look at something, you're not just throwing things at the wall and hoping something sticks. You know how density works. You know how the thread goes together. You know how software talks to the machine through the medium of the file. Now you have some real power. Now you have some tools, and that's how it is. But yeah, Ron talking about the cartooning, yeah, bringing in the angle and stitch length for every segment. Those were the good old days. Sometimes I miss them. Absolutely. Here's what I'll say. Though I very much have enjoyed and do enjoy the automation that goes into embroidery software now, the one thing I will say is I'm very glad that a portion of the files I learned from as a young digitizer, the stuff that was there were these hand punched stitch by stitch pieces that were done on the old school boards. I mean, I'm really glad I learned from those because even though I knew that not all softwares created all features or functions, you couldn't reproduce everything you saw in one software and another, I always knew that there was the fallback position of if I need to put a stitch exactly where I need to put it, I can use a manual stitch or move the stitch in the final stitch file after the digitizing process. I can move the stitch where I want it. I can put stitches where I want them with the manual stitch tool. And I think also I knew very early on that not everything I saw was like if I was looking at a design and it had a smoke trail in it that had all these randomized stitches in it and curls and things in this smoke trail or a cloud or something very organic, that it was highly likely in these older designs that they were made stitch by stitch, but it also let me understand that if I really want to make an effect and I have the time to spend, if I'm charging a customer enough to make that jacket back masterpiece that has that shading in it, I always can go all the way back down to the most basic tool and start punching in stitches by hand. Or as I do now, I can do a hybrid method where I say, all right, if I understand how far apart my stitches need to be, and I understand what that density means, I don't have to use a fill tool to fill an area with stitches. I can use any of the tools. I can use my straight stitch tool if I am happy to have my repeats, my stitch lengths be very even along the line and draw those lines myself. I can do that. Not to mention, and not something I'm always going to talk about, but you may see me do this once in a while. I can also go into my vector software. Now that we can import vectors, you guys are going to probably shake your heads and go, Eric, you're talking about vector import. You're always telling me to redraw. I got you. Hold with me for a second. If my vector software has a way of making lines, like say making spirals or something that it does better than my software or differently than my software or better for a particular use, or maybe it has some blending effect or something weird where I can get lines that are useful to add stitching to, I can do that in my vector software, pull it in at size. If I already had in my mind the way that the stitches should go, I can plan in my vector software and draw at the measurements at the scale I should to make something useful when I bring it over. You could totally, if you wanted to, and I don't advocate this, you could draw embroidery shapes, shapes that already had compensation in them, correct overlapping in them, everything else in a vector program, pull those into your software and drop in, make sure you had your sequencing, your travels. You can actually even draw all of that in. At the end, go in there and then go through each one of those shapes and add all of your inclination lines and stitch types and settings. You could do that. I'm not saying that's a good idea to do. It sounds like an extra step for just drawing inside of your digitizing software, but you could. And knowing how that works means that we can use all manner of tools to get to the end result we want. We can do some crazy stuff if we want to, but it is one of those things that you need to know the foundations. Otherwise, you won't know where you're headed. The most important thing for you to know isn't where the buttons are in your digitizing software so much as what kind of stitches you want where and why, and what you have to change about them to make them look the way you want them to be. However, yes, there is still definitely software specific knowledge. There are tools in different software packages that are very different, and you have to know that stuff. In the end, you will have to get software based knowledge. So if I talk about this foundational knowledge a lot, and some people have said, kind of accused me of like, oh, you never teach software. I do separately, depending on where I'm at. I especially like coming up in the next year, you'll probably see me do some stitch artist teaching directly because that's the platform that I work with personally, where I may talk about some stuff. But when I do that, then I can be free to go specifically into tools. Otherwise, I try and give you guys all foundational knowledge. So if you're out there right now running, you're running Melco Design Shop, you're running Wilcom, you're running Stitch Artist like I am, you're running, any number of pieces, you're running any of the Wilcom variants, you're running Chroma. Any one of these is going to have most of the same basic stitch types, and they're almost definitely going to have like the most basic four, the straight stitch, or manual stitch, straight stitch, satin stitch, and fill stitch are going to be there for sure, and many permutations of other zigzags and everything else. Those are all going to be there. So if you learn what stitch values are and how to get what you want, you will be able to create what you want in just about any software. And then you can start to look at softwares and say, does it have something extra that's important to me? Since I'm always a stitch artist, one of the ones I always talk about is the patch edge that's in Stitch Artist 3. If you want the faux mirrored edge that does automatic cornering, that's very special for that. Or if you want, we talked about Stitch Artist 2, where it has the automatic foam capping and planking. If you want automatic foam tools so you don't have to make your own caps all the time to cut off the foam at the ends of satin stitches, you can get that. Or let's say you have something specific you want out of Wilcom. There's many tools that are in there. Or like a pattern making. You want to make your own fill stitch patterns. Not all software has that. You're in Wilcom ES, and it allows you to make your own partition lines for a fill. Not something I've done a lot of. The textured fills, I usually preset ones are enough for me, and I don't usually do a lot of custom ones, but sometimes you do. Then that's something you can look at for each tool and say, this is something I want from this specific tool. But the basis is still knowing what stitches do, how they should be put together, and what you can change. And then the other cool thing is knowing some of these values, we can go into different softwares and see we can play with. We can see what matters in each particular type. And it does get into the software knowledge side, but it's still based on the basic variables. And before I harp on this again later, I'm just going to make it clear. As you guys know, my little stock design collection is called The Only Stitch. TheOnlyStitch.com, if you care. There's the same stock designs you've seen forever. I keep forgetting to add more, but hey, I'm making designs for a much larger platform now. However, the reason I call my personal collection of stitches The Only Stitch, the reason I call that stock design collection that is that our machines can really only make one stitch. We always have these stitch types and collections of stitches. But here's the thing. The only thing an interlock sewing machine, which is essentially what we have, can do is make one stitch from point to point. It's going to drop the needle. It's going to lift that needle and drop it again, which is a single taut line that is the width of the thread. That is what we can do. We can't tie knots above it. We can't pull loops in it. That's a chenille machine. If you want to see something that pulls a loop of thread from the bottom and has a stick out, if you like that moss stitch look, well, that's a different machine. But by and large, most of us are running standard embroidery machines. They work like a sewing machine. They make a line from point to point. Also, that line is always straight because we're pulling a stitch taut. So any curve you make out of running stitches is always just small little facets of a polygon. And we're always playing to try and make those smooth out and how small those can be before the texture of small stitches looks pebbly and all that other stuff. But we're going to talk about that, right? So the concept here today is to say, what are these numbers?